Hello, this is Mike Powell. I am president of the Brunswick Civil War Roundtable. We've been trying to put some history on the Facebook page for some folks. So this is another in a series of short articles, I guess we'll call them, on Civil War. What I want to talk about today is which was the most important theater of the war, the Eastern Theater or the Western Theater or the Trans-Mississippi Theater. So let me bring up my PowerPoint and we'll get started. Okay, there we go. The first 100 years or so of Civil War writing after the war ended was heavily weighted to Eastern Theater. The events west of the Appalachians were ignored by many. I think that the group of Confederates known as the Lost Causers share some responsibility. Core to their belief was that the Confederacy was really not defeated, but simply overwhelmed by massive Union numbers. Their advocacy was for Virginia and for Robert E. Lee. The vast collection of documents that they gathered and published as the Southern Historical Society papers in, I think it's 120 some volumes, concentrated on Eastern Theater. I think they set the agenda for some time. However, there are many reasons why the Western Theater did not gain the interest in the country the way that the Eastern Theater did. It has only been in the last 50 years or so that the Western Theater has been recognized and its importance appreciated. And our good friend Ed Bars had a lot to do with that shift in emphasis. So let's look at some factors of each theater and see why it was important. Geographically, when you see the map here, the Eastern Theater went from the Appalachians to the sea. The Western Theater was from the Appalachians to the Mississippi River, and the Trans-Mississippi Theater is self-explanatory. Okay. We see here another advantage. It would be significant that the rivers of the Western Theater mostly run north to south. Militarily, they were daggers into the Confederacy to be taken advantage of by the North and their naval superiority on the rivers. The rivers in the East generally run from west to east, and they provided defensive barriers to movements that were headed north or south. The railroads in the war, we see in the East, the war seemed to be about the capitals of Richmond and Washington, D.C. How many on-to Richmond campaigns were there? The railroads played a part in the East, to be sure, but they were used by armies to get to the battlefield, such as at First Manassas. They were not strategic objectives on their own. The railroads in the West were decisive for whoever had them. Distances in the West made it necessary for the movement of troops and supplies to use the rails. Vicksburg was important because of the railroad that crossed the river. That was the objective. Chattanooga was a railroad hub and controlled the rails of the Upper South. Atlanta was another railroad hub and controlled the railroads of the Lower South. These were strategic objectives. These three battles, Vicksburg, Chattanooga, and Atlanta, were militarily decisive because of the dramatic effect that it had on the South, effects far beyond the battlefield. The loss of those railroads began the ever-shrinking Confederacy. The battles in the East did not have that type of significance beyond the casualties, beyond the newspaper headlines, or beyond the morale effect that the battle had on the public. They were not conclusive. What was the lasting effect of the defeat of the Union at Bull Run? They fell back on D.C., regrouped for another on to Richmond campaign. What was the lasting effect of McClellan's defeat in the Peninsula? Fall back, regroup. After second Bull Run, the same. Even the victory at Antietam did not produce lasting military advantage for the Union. It did allow Lincoln to announce his Emancipation Proclamation, but that again was a political goal, even though it did have a military significance away from the battlefield. It brought to an end any Southern Confederacy hope of European intervention. But that was more to do about the blockade. The South wanted England to help them break the Union blockade to get Southern cotton. Those hopes died with the Emancipation Proclamation, but it was nothing to do with the battlefield. The breadbasket of the South was in the West. Manufacturing and industrial centers were in the East, but the West was more agrarian. Cutting Confederate railroads had a dramatic effect on Lee's supply lines. Northern Virginia had been picked clean of provisions. The Shenandoah Valley was always contested, and alone could not feed the Confederate armies in the East by itself. The South depended on its supplies from the Western breadbasket, Tennessee, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, and so on. As the Confederacy shrank, these supply lines dried up. Another reason that the East received much more attention at the time was because it was the seat of government, the political center for both. Their proximity, 107 miles apart, made them magnets for armies, and so you had battles in that general Northern Virginia area. Capital cities, though, are false strategic objectives. Capturing the city itself does not always mean victory and end of the war. Destroy the armies protecting those cities, and they fall de facto. Richmond fell, but the war did not end until Lee's army was contained. The East had big cities, and they had big newspapers. They were influential, and they were political bases for the Washington politicians and also the Richmond politicians. Because they were close to the battlefields in the East, the newspapers could provide coverage of the event with pictures very soon after the fact. The newspapers in the West were not so numerous and not so close to the front. By the time correspondents arrived at the battlefield, the war had often moved on. Likewise, the photographers of the day, Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner, Timothy O'Sullivan, were all based in New York and Washington. Brady's collection of the dead of Antietam had such an effect on the population was not hardly possible in the West unless the photographer was actually traveling with the army. And finally, the East gained so much importance because of that man there, Robert E. Lee. The old saying, victory has many fathers while defeat is an orphan, was very true in the Civil War, and Lee and his army of Northern Virginia were great press. Victory after victory was detailed in every newspaper, and the legends grew quickly. While out in the West, it was defeat after defeat. New Orleans captured, loss of Fort Henry and Donelson, loss at Shiloh, defeat after defeat. But the victories for the North in the Western theater were often kicked off the front page because of something that Bobby Lee or Stonewall Jackson had done. The heart and soul of the Confederacy was in the Eastern theater. There are arguments on both sides to say which was the most important theater. They had importance for different reasons. I believe the Western theater was the militarily decisive theater of the war, while the Eastern theater was the political theater of the war. The North had to conquer the West in order to defeat the Confederacy in the East. Had the Eastern theater fallen first and Richmond captured, I feel certain that Davis would have moved his capital to some Western city and tried to continue the war. What do you think? Thanks, and hope you enjoyed that.